All right. Now, does it say the little button? We're recording. Okay, good. All right, everyone. Thanks for being patient while we waited for a few moments for everyone to join. So for those that do not know me, my name is Stephanie Chismar, and I'm the president of our local chapter of ISTF. I also have Meredith, Ian, Zainab, and Sophie, our other officers on this call. And typically Erin will be here if she's not already, so she'll usually join. So with that being said, we'll go ahead and get started. Maybe. There we go. Oh, okay. So just a refresher, we're a student-led organization that acts pretty much harmoniously with the College of Natural Resources, but we're really trying to expand interdisciplinarily throughout the university, as well as with private sector, the public sector outside of the university. So really trying to capture every nook and cranny of international forestry, as well as the tropics, and really help orient us during this time of what else is still out there, beyond our walls of our quarantine zones. We have one more meeting this semester. That's the chapter meeting. I have invited a speaker. They haven't confirmed yet, so I'll let you guys know on what to expect for the topic, as well as who might be speaking. And if we don't nail down a speaker, then we can always try to do something like we suggested on that Google form. And I want to thank everyone that participated and filled that out. It was quite informational and informative, and really helps us kind of plan ahead to make sure everyone that's a member or active in ISTF, that this is oriented to you all, that it's going to benefit all of us by exploring potential options for careers, looking into different aspects of topics that we maybe not have been exposed to in our curriculum. So anything that we can try to bring to our community and help expand our thought processes on the tropics. We also, so in that Google form, we talked about it, the responses were pretty strong for having a watch party for, I'll show the responses on the movies, and as well as a group walk was pretty, as long as I think we all are responsible, that we should be able to work that out this semester. So again, make sure if you are a new member, please put your email and your preferred name in the chat, and we'll add you to our list. So that way you can receive any notices of what we're doing, as well as any of the announcements through our newsletter, where we include different meetings, as well as articles, news, anything like that. And we try to stay pretty active on social media. So again, this will be on our YouTube, as well as we try to post before meetings, and when we can, when we're at events, via our other social media accounts. If you're interested in leadership, we typically like to kind of have a mentor program where you would start out in the spring, kind of being introduced to the types of activities and responsibilities that our officers have, and then start in the fall. So please just let any of the officers know. So for our topics of choice for future meetings, it seemed like climate change, tropical ecology, economics and rural development, and then followed by biodiversity and forest health are quite popular. So we're going to try to vet people in these areas for the upcoming meetings, so that way we can hopefully keep everyone interested and hopefully relevant for what you all are looking to learn more about. And for the watch party, we had equal or tie between Utopia and the Jungle Book. So I'll keep it open to both of those, and I'll see which one is going to be, easier or able to be shared and streamed. I think we both are all between the officers. We want our, if not all of us, have access to some of these. So we will make sure, and we are thinking about, and if there's any objections, or if any of you would prefer it not to be on a wellness day, please put it in the chat. This is something that we thought about, but we're because I know a lot of people are going to be planning ahead for different types of activities, and we don't want to deter from that. But we also recognize that this isn't like our normal meeting. We're not going to be having an academic or semi-academic talk or conversation. This is more just social and just to kind of enjoy each other's company until we can be more in person. So with that, there was overwhelming support for Wednesdays as well as later in the evening. So there's this day that we've put kind of on the books, but if there's any if anyone can't make this that really wants to, or if there's enough support for changing the date, we will. Lastly, we were looking into a group walk. So we have a few different options, whether we meet at Poolin Park, Dorothea Dix Park, or Lake Raleigh. I wanted to make sure that it's locations that, since transportation options are not quite back to normal, that each of us could get to these places in case we didn't have a car, or that live hopefully that aren't near campus. So if that's if anybody's interested in that, we'll kind of plan ahead for maybe the Friday after our last meeting, so at our normal time. And then if that day rains, which in North Carolina you never know, potentially the next Friday. And that we would typically do is meet at a central location at these places, because I don't think we'll be able to do much carpooling still at this point in time, but something to where we could at least wear our mask, social distance, but enjoy the weather while it's nice, and each other's be able to see each other's faces more than just through a computer. So for those of you who didn't know or did, Monday was International Women's Day, and this was I didn't really think ahead of time. I knew about Women's History Month or International Women's Day when inviting our speaker, but it just happened to work perfectly. So with that, I just wanted to kind of, I wasn't completely aware of the history of International Women's Day, so I wanted to learn more, so I figured I'd share it with you all. So this theme for this year was Choose to Challenge, and this actually, in first International Women's Day, it's been over a century. So it was in 1911. So I thought that was, I did not know that it's been that long, that it's been on the books, at least in, certain countries. And that was quite inspiring, as well as their missions are, and their kind of themes. So with that, I'm going to pause my screen sharing and hand it over to Dr. Nora Haenn. And she will speak today. She's from our university, the Department of Anthropology and Sociology. So let me get to that. All right. Nora, if you would like to start screen sharing and take it over.
Will do. So first of all, let me say hi to everybody, because I can see all your names on the screen. And now when I screen share, I think that's going to go away. But really great to be here. And I want to especially thank Sophie and Stephanie for inviting me. So let's do this. Okay. So Stephanie, can you just confirm that the full screen share is going? Okay, great. All right. So again, thanks for coming today. Now, when Stephanie wrote me, she said that what called her attention about my work is this focus on gender, and social dynamics in rural Mexico. And I also did not know it was International Women's Day. One of the things that I think is interesting is International Women's Day, part of the UN system, does tend to get celebrated more outside the United States than inside. But this year, I've had more folks wish me a happy International Women's Day than ever before. So I think it's coming here. But I think you're going to see that in my talk, this kind of call to action, this kind of choose to challenge is going to be pretty much on the front. And if you see me looking down, I've got some notes here, because if I don't stay on my notes, I go over time, and I've got a little clock here. Okay. So what I want to talk to you about today are two sites of gendered practices, because I knew when I got invited, I was going to have a bunch of students in the room, and I said, this is my chance to talk about some professional development around gender, not just research. And so I want to talk about the gendered institutions in which we work, and the gendered practices in what I would call my field site, but are places of practice that are outside our immediate institution, outside the offices where we show up. And I'm going to take inspiration from two sources. So some of you might be familiar with the field of feminist political ecology. It's been going strong since the 1990s. And feminist political ecology has placed attention on how access to natural resources, decision-making around natural resources, and the actual hands-on hands-on work with natural resources, how all of this is gendered. It's not gender neutral. And so we do have to think about how access to decision-making around and the actual management of natural resources are gendered. Okay, but that's not the only part. All of us in this room work and study in gendered institutions. And so while I'll be taking NC State as my example today, because of course that's where I work and that's where a place I know, I would never kind of limit this analysis just to NC State. We all work in gendered institutions. And to that sense, I'm drawing inspiration from a podcast that I really like called Battle Tactics for Your Sexist Workplace. Can totally recommend it, Battle Tactics for Your Sexist Workplace, and we're going to have some battle tactics to talk about later on. Okay, so of course, when we talk about gendered sites of practice, there's this third point, which is our home life, but I won't be addressing that today. Sorry, what is that? That is, I think, oh, that's my alarm telling me I'm supposed to be giving a talk at the with you all right now. Okay. I want to jump right into some of the conversations that are taking place in the area of gender. For example, conservation science right now, as other sciences, lots of calls for gender parity on conference panels. So both men refusing to join conference panels that doesn't have gender parity, and women demanding that they not be the only kind of token woman on the panel. And so there's a recent article in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution on that point. And so also we have to think about, so that's kind of for me like the inward engagement. So within my profession, within my institution, but outward engagement, which would be this kind of field setting, the arrangements could look very different. My apologies. My apologies. I'm not really sure why this is happening, so I'm just going to turn this off. Okay. And to explain why I think we need to keep these two places, our institutional employer and our field setting, in the picture together when we think about gendered research, living these gendered lives we do. I want to give you two profiles of researchers / practitioners from the early 1990s when I was a student, much like many of you are. Okay. So I don't have any pictures for this, but the first profile is a graduate student whose name I have forgotten, but I met him in a summer class in Chapel Hill. Now, before entering graduate school, I had worked for the Nature Conservancy, and it was at this time, I'm like 21, I'm working as a secretary for the Nature Conservancy. I learned the phrase conservation cowboy. Have you guys ever heard this phrase? Conservation cowboy. Okay. Well, as you can imagine, these were not actual cowboys, but it was a label people were applying to men who carried kind of a certain swagger. And I love the idea that you guys haven't heard this phrase because maybe it's a thing of the past. While I was at the Conservancy, I didn't really understand what this label meant. And then I went to this summer school and there was a young man there and his wardrobe basically consisted of jeans. Okay. But then he also had these like really hard to secure t-shirts. All the t-shirts were from Latin American conservation groups from different countries, you know, so they had the logos and they had kind of Spanish slogans. And so in obvious and not so obvious ways, he was telling us about all his travels and his ability to intern or work in Latin America. And he really did kind of have a bit of a swagger. So it occurred to me, oh, I think this is what people meant by that phrase, conservation cowboys. Okay, the second profile is that of a graduate student, a young woman who also was in Chapel Hill that summer, but her story is a little bit different. And I can name her because she's a friend to this day. Her name is Julia. And Julia is a Canadian anthropologist, and she was carrying out research in a forested part of Mexico in the mid-1990s. One of the first field researchers in this part of Mexico, which is really going to be relevant. And also at the time, this part of Mexico only had primary schools, so people didn't really know what university and researchers were, also relevant. Julia had a partner who was Mexican and an agronomist. So one day, Julia was accompanying the agronomist with a farmer, a campesino, or a peasant, to the farmer's fields. And the fields were located in forest, because this is a forested region. And as I've written about before, at the time, forests were considered a place of work, and mostly men's work. So people in the forest, for any other reason than work, timber cutting, farming, hunting, if you were there for any other reason, your motivations were suspect, because it was considered kind of antisocial to be there for other reasons. So on this trip, Julia is accompanying this agronomist boyfriend with a peasant, and the guy comes up to her, the peasant, and asks her, how much does she charge? So remember, Julia was one of the first foreign researchers in the region, and many peasants were still trying to figure out who these researchers were. Well, an unmarried woman accompanying two men into the woods could only be up to one thing, and that thing was prostitution. Okay. So in the 1990s and up until today, women and men alike are navigating gendered institutions. To this day, if I said the phrase conservation cowboy, you're probably thinking of a man. To this day, can you imagine a male researcher being confused for a prostitute? If you've ever heard of such a case, let me know. I totally want to hear about it. So for the rest of my talk, what I want to do is relate some recent research on gendered aspects of the US workplace, especially gendered models of leadership, which set the tone for our working lives. And then I want to turn to an article that is about fisheries, not forest, but I want you to know that it's about common pool resources, and forests in Mexico are also common pool resources, so there's that connection. But the article I published with my student Ben Siegelman, where we both relate Ben's gendered experience of field research and how that experience of masculinity was linked to masculine management of the fisheries. So these two parts of my talk are not going to be tightly connected, because one of the main points I want to make is that conservation and natural resource management require moving across multiple and distinct gendered situations. And that's also a little bit where the professional development comes in. I want you guys to be prepared for this. I want you guys to have tools at your disposal to navigate this in ways that are as satisfying as possible for you. Okay. So what the two parts do share is an understanding of gender as a building block of basically three components of our lives that you see here on this slide. The social structures we move through, these would be the institutions. The cultural beliefs and norms that we ascribe to, and the agency, the individual agency with which we navigate these. And you'll see that I made the individual agency block a little bit smaller because it is not as determinative as the other two. Now, one more thing about this is to know that all of this is utterly taken for granted in the sense that as we move through our lives, culture itself is taken for granted. We need that for our own sanity, but things are taken for granted until they aren't, And one of the main ways anthropologists see kind of these taken for granted norms, beliefs, social structures, possibilities for agency, one of the ways we see these kind of coming to light out of the taken for granted context is when people start disagreeing about them. When people start arguing them, it's like, oh, there's that rule. That rule must have been there all the time because now they're disagreeing over it. Okay, and so as I mentioned earlier, what I hope to do is also, I got kind of two slides in here where we can talk about battle tactics for your sexist workplace. And I hope at the end we'll all share some strategies for responding to some of these dilemmas, the social structures, cultural norms and beliefs, etc. Okay, so let's start with the first part, which is the academy in which we're located, the place we're training you to be professionals, and the kind of gender messages you're probably getting Of course, this will be a partial analysis, but some of the gender messages you're getting at NC State. Well, to be frank, the academy is a sexist workplace. So this first line here, in 2016, women represented 26% of all tenured professors. And this is down one notch from 27% in 2003. So effectively in the last 20 years, the percentage of women in the academy in tenure streams, so I don't have the data here on non-tenure track, TAs and all that sort of thing, but in the tenure stream, we've been basically stagnant. And I do want to point out here at the bottom, this kind of support for you all that you have access to for free through NC State to help you with mentoring. And I thought this was really interesting that the problem is more acute at doctoral granting institutions, because one of the themes that I see as we go through this is that the greater the prestige of the institution, the more acute, I think, or the more acute the gender differences are. Okay, so here's some more data that I just pulled up. NCSU doesn't have a single woman among the top 10 highest paying jobs on our campus. This is a new study that's out just this week. You can see the differences here. From a couple other universities. This is just what happened when I pulled up the word North. I think there were a couple of universities that were at parity 50-50. There was like Brown University, I think it was the first, but it was also probably Brown because it was B. Okay. And here's some more data. This is the number of women at different ranks across the assistant associate full levels. And I just kind of added in here the underrepresented and white proportions there too, so you can get a sense of that. And, you know, a minute ago, I said that the problems become more acute at higher levels. Just want you to notice the distinction at the full professor level. So on the one hand, we could say, you know, that's kind of a lag in that women would, those are the oldest cohort. But I want you to notice that that cohort has, you know, been around since, well, let's see, if you were to become an assistant professor today and move lickety split all the way up to full professor, you're there in 10 or 15 years. You're there in 10 or 15 years. So while that kind of, you know, reflects a certain lag, this lag is not necessarily dating to the 70s. Okay. And here's some information about salary distinctions. So gender disparity on salary distinctions. Okay. And I chose the 2017 data because NC State did its own salary study there. And that's actually a quote at that bottom slide that you see there. And the distinction here is that the numbers on the slide are from the Chronicle of Higher Education. This is totally available to all of us. And those are listing average salaries, whereas the NC State 2017 report was working with median salaries, Okay. Okay, so before we get to that one. Okay, so one of the main takeaways here, I think, is that progress through the ranks really matters. And I think this is not just in universities, but this is also going to be in conservation and environmental management institutions. And the reason is for us in the university is that full professors is where your campus leadership is going to come from. And in turn, full professors are the people who are going to be able to establish policy, assign salary increases, advocate for faculty, and importantly, evaluate work performance. And so in the spirit of evaluating work performance, I want to switch tracks here. So I'm going to leave the university and I'm going to go somewhere else to talk about cultural models of leadership, because we don't really, I don't have this study in front of me on cultural models of leadership in the university per se. But just today, my department is hosting a speaker from Chapel Hill whose team examined the written performance reviews of a Silicon Valley tech company. So the company's really making efforts towards gender parity, so much so that they actually allowed researchers to examine the written performance reviews. And so they're looking at the written performance reviews, and then they're looking at the kind of number. So, you know, are you a 5? Are you a 4? And they're not just looking at the words, they're looking at how those words also translated into rankings, which would then result, say, in salary increases. And so one of the things they found was that when people were talking about technical ability, they tended to use gender neutral language, but then not surprisingly, in the evaluation of personality and communication style, gendered things came back in. I was surprised that men actually get critiqued for being too soft. I wasn't surprised that women get critiqued for being too aggressive. And this is super interesting, taking charge being associated with the highest performance ratings for men, but not for women. I was not that surprised that men were more likely to be viewed as genius or visionary, but I was really surprised that, and this is going to come up a little bit later, that being described as helpful was not actually helpful to advancing your career. It resulted in lower numerical scores in your evaluation. Okay. So, you know, a quick Google search will pull up a bunch of cultural models of leadership in the US, and maybe you've seen some of these names. And, you know, leadership programs are so common on university campuses nowadays. But a lot of these tend to be kind of aspirational. They tend to be kind of philosophies that people apply to the way they manage others. And so one of the questions was, what does actual leadership look like? And so here I'm going to turn to the business psychology research, and I have to apologize to all the very nice guys in the room. This really is the title of this book, because the business psychologists say that in reality, these are the qualities most likely to be found in leadership and business management. And so to quote the author, our sector, our normative data, which includes thousands of managers from across all industry sectors and 40 countries, shows that men are consistently more arrogant, manipulative, and risk-prone than women. The idea that men are more risk-prone is actually kind of sustained in other fields. For example, men tend to support genetically modified crops more than women do. And a part of my life is campus is associated with the Genetic Engineering and Society Center. And so why are these so many men? Well, the authors in their research found that 70% of the managers in business are men. 70% of the managers are business and men. And so these traits have to be marked masculine because 70% of the managers are men. And if you, I came across this by listening to that podcast, Battle Tactics for Your Sexist Workplace. And you know, one of the things he says on that, which is really funny, is he says, you know, why do we always talk about quotas for women? Why don't we talk about the invisible quota for men? And they said, what? He's like, well, yeah, well, if consistently men are at 70% of management, if consistently men are 25, 30% of the tenure stream professors, then effectively there's an invisible quota for men operating at about the 70% level. Okay. Also, when you look at these skills, do you see a conservation cowboy could be in there? Yeah. Yeah. All right. I promise you some battle tactics. So based on this research, one of the things they say that happens a lot is that people are confusing confidence with competence, which makes sense. I have absolutely been susceptible to someone telling me they can do something and not looking closer. Also, they said that basically in the hiring process, so the argument here is that because so much of the hiring is based on interviews, that what happens in interviews is charisma rises to the top. And so when you're hiring, what you want to do is say, if I never met this person, what is all the information I would need? You know, could I, for example, talk to people who this person used to manage? We can't really do that. It's very complicated, but nonetheless, you can, in the hiring process, premise the soft skills and the emotional intelligence. And obviously, you know, I've just shared with you some data from NC State, shared with you some data from the business sector. You know, the data matters, and knowing that data can help you understand that you, one, need to form alliances, and that we need to change things where and when you can. So that's my call to action, but I really want to underscore the where and when you can, because I am not expecting everybody to be 100% gung-ho all the time with the battle tactics for your sexist workplace. I want to recognize that people are at different stages of their career. They have different, and I'm going to use this phrase again, time, talents, and treasure. Time, talents, and treasure. And so we want to think strategically about what works for you, and not, I don't want to suggest that kind of people, all people have to do all things at all times. Okay. Okay. So earlier we talked about taken for granted context, and you can kind of see here how it comes to play in a university setting in which the social structure, which are the faculty ranks, which include the kind of administration structure, are interacting with cultural norms of who is valued. And so here's where for me, the salary comes in, because salary is about what you value and what behaviors get valued. And all of that is contributing to this situation. And I kind of pulled this quote there from a landmark article, because I think it can be daunting when you see all these things interacting. But another way, actually, there is an article that I didn't cite for this one, but it's called Points to Intervene in the System. Points to intervene in the system. So you can kind of think about points where stuff comes together and maybe spend your time there. Okay. Okay. So now I want to leave the university setting to carry out, to talk about some of the research Ben and I did. And so when you all do the same, hopefully you will, all those familiar arrangements are going to change. Now, given the predominance of patriarchal power structures, and we can talk about anthropologists' understanding of why there's such a predominance of patriarchal power structures across the world, these new arrangements might feel familiar because, yeah, you're raised in a patriarchy and you walk into a patriarchal setting. But remember my friend Julia's seemingly innocuous trip to the farmer's fields, right? You never thought that taking a walk through the forest would confuse you for a prostitute, okay? So the devil really is in the details. And so for the rest of the talk, what I want to do is kind of review this article that we carried out with. So a little bit here, the division of labor. This is Ben's fieldwork, Ben Siegelman, brilliant anthropologist. And you're going to see that he's, as a man, was the only one who could explore the masculinity here. My contribution entailed the theoretical framework and a good chunk of the write-up. And then Javier Basurto, he financial support, super important, and really a depth of learning, because Ben was working in a field site where Javier has had like more than a decade, maybe 20 years time commitment. So I'm going to be talking about fisheries, but I do want you to think about forests, because I'm going to be talking about common pool resource management. And the reason I could contribute to this is because where I work in forest, they're also male-dominated common pool resource management. Okay, so here's our setting. We're in Baja California, and as I mentioned, a common pool fishery. Ben's working in a village of about 100 people. It is down a dirt road, but it's not as isolated as it sounds, because it's also kind of a fish market, and so people come in for the fish market. And in addition to the common pool fisheries, there's a couple other resources, which are village land and then goats that people hunt out on these islands. And I'm not going to talk about the village land or the goats, but in the longer article, one of the things that Ben does is he lines up and says, look, these are the masculine performances associated with the fisheries, which are different from the masculine performances associated with the goat hunting, which are different still from a little bit the masculine performances associated with village land. And so, you know, the devil in the details, right? Performances of masculinity and femininity in association with specific natural resources, and how these resources can kind of be interdependent. And one of the ways you can understand how people are managing their fisheries is by looking at how they're managing their goats and vice versa. And I think when we think about forest, for example, we don't always think about it as kind of interlocking perhaps with other natural resources. But for smallholder householders, which are my main concern, smallholder householders, they're pulling together a range of resources to make a living. And so they're going to be juggling different property regimes and, as we'll say, different gendered expressions and associated with those. And so Ben was interested in social capital because there's lots of research on social capital and the talk about how social capital is needed to manage common pool resources. Social capital needs to be strengthened so that people can protect their resources. But what is social capital exactly? And so one of the proposed definitions that we work with is that social capital is basically trust among fishermen. And that's Ben right there on the right in his field site. But what is trust? Okay, can you depend on each other? Are you honest with each other? Can you give each other reliable information? Do you share expectations? Okay, so to take it a little bit deeper, we can have 3 ways of thinking about social capital. From an institutional standpoint, social capital could just be your social network. From a communitarian standpoint, it could be that trust. And notice the little bit of romanticization here, that trust within a group, enriches our lives. Now, the critical framework, which is something we're also very amenable to, is that the social capital is any resource that that's gained. It's something you actually have to get. It isn't just a given, and you get it through access to relationships. Because you're getting your social capital through access to relationships, you're getting it through pre-existing power structures and pre-existing networks of prestige that shape those power structures. And so where we want to come in is talk about performance. So how do you gain prestige in a power network? Well, one of the things we say is that, well, you have to perform. You have to do the things that are valued by that network. You have to carry out exchanges. You have to accrue credentials. And that's where the masculinity is going to come in. Yet, in the social capital literature, basically, gender, along with other identities, has been treated as a no-go area. Really, they're not talking about gender very much in the social capital literature. Had to kind of dig pretty deeply to even find like a sentence here or there. All right, so then our question became, well, what performances do fishermen enact that allow them to leverage resources, carry out exchanges, and accrue credentials in this male-dominated network, which is this common pool fisheries in Baja California? And what Ben found was that basically people were joking constantly. So embustero is a joker, but embustero en buena onda is like, good-natured ribbing, good-natured ribbing. But it was endless, absolutely endless. And we have some long examples in the article itself that I would encourage you to take a look at. Ben talking about how he's on a boat out on the water, and they start pulling these jokes on him in this kind of literally a gullibility test. He said it really was. They're just like, when is this guy going to figure out that we're pulling something on him? But they aren't just gullibility tests, and you can't always tell when someone is joking and when it's not. This is a very brilliant performance. There's a shifting terrain. You're not really sure where you stand, either with your audience. And remember that idea that social capital is built on trust. So how do you have a social capital built on trust if you have this kind of joking going on? And so what we want to do is basically revisit that definition of trust and say, we think it may be overblown a bit. Okay. And so then once, Ben figured out about this extensive joking, which in Spanish also goes by the word lie. So mentira. So if I'm pulling your leg or something, I might say, ay, no, es una mentira, no te preocupes, like, no, don't worry, it's just a lie. But we wanted to kind of take seriously that lies and jokes are synonyms for each other. Okay. And it's really important that only men do engage in this activity, not women. And the women in this village would admit that. They would say, no, that's something men do. We don't really do that. So this is very explicitly a male behavior. Okay. And so I put up here a book by Nora Haenn, Harmony and Ecology, which for those of us who work in Mexico is kind of a classic at this point. And so we're thinking about the work that joking does. And so pretty clearly the first level was that it's managing competition in fishery. You know, a lot of the joking is about, well, where'd you get that fish? Oh, you know, I got it over there. Was there a lot of fish? Oh, there was so much fish over there, you know? So a lot of it is about managing competition in a shared fishery. And then a lot of it was about maintaining a facade of harmony. And this is very common in rural Mexico, in part because there are really just no reliable justice mechanisms. And so people will say, oh, we don't have any problems here. Everybody gets along. And you're like, you know, they don't get along. You know, they have problems, but they can't bring the problems out in the open because there are so few mechanisms to actually deal with them, address them. And so they have to kind of keep a lid on things because let's face it, they have to live with each other. And in a village of 100 people, you know everything about each other. Which gets us to the fourth point about why people are always joking, because they're trying to manage these kind of high levels of interdependence with the desire for autonomy. You know? So how do you be your own person in a village of 100 people where everybody's married to everybody and everybody literally knows the color of your underwear because you dry your clothes out on the line? So joking helps people create this space of autonomy. And when these kinds of four things are at play, you know, a single joke could be doing all of these things all at once. Or a single joke could start out to maintain a facade of harmony. You know, you're kind of ribbing that guy you like, who's bothering you, and you kind of want to get back at them. But really, you're also kind of ribbing him because you feel like he stole your spot out in the ocean or something like that. And so it could be really hard to kind of disentangle what a single joke was about. And that was the point. And that was the point. It provided people cover to navigate all these different tensions. Okay. But again, they were all men. And the jokes, the content of the jokes were about drinking. The contents of the jokes were about womanizing and going into town and hanging out with prostitutes or going to table dances. The inventions of sexual prowess, they were, you know, messing with Ben about, oh, Ben, bet you're gonna, you know, go have sex somewhere, or, you know, you're masturbating all the time because you haven't seen your wife in forever. And notice that this is very inhospitable to women. This is explicitly gendered and entirely inhospitable to women. So, you know, this raises some questions for us, and I don't have easy answers here, even if I do have some battle tactics. If this is the localized social capital, and for the women in the room, this sort of social capital, some kind of masculinized version of social capital is very likely to be in the place where you do your research or you carry out your work. You know, what do we do with this information? We have different gender norms. We have a more egalitarian gender norms. And so how should we face this reality? Okay. How can female conservation practitioners account for practices they might not have access to? Because as I mentioned, this is Ben's field work. I was never, ever going to get this data, ever. It's just not going to happen. So if I were to carry out research in this place, how do I account for the fact that I don't have access to this information? And then this is super important for me. What role should male practitioners play in these interactions? What does allyship look like in these gendered settings? Okay, so here are my battle tactics. Surprise, surprise. Read the anthropology, read the sociology. Don't go in blind on the gender dynamics. You know, but notice the kind of local understanding, because localism matters. Localism really matters. I don't know anything about goats. I don't know anything about fisheries, but see what you can dig up on local gender dynamics, at least to kind of, even if you can't get that specific site, to have some questions in your mind, like, could this be happening? Could that be happening? Okay. You know, it is entirely possible a woman could go into that community, go on boats and do some kind of research. It's breaking a barrier. You can do that, but you don't have to. You know, whatever you want, just know the consequences for you. Just know the consequences for you. And again, whether your choice aligns with your time, treasure, and talent. Your time, treasure, and talent. Don't have to be everywhere at all times. You don't have to fix every gender problem that comes up. And then, of course, for the men in the room, we need allies. We need allies. And what does that look like? I want to underscore removing obstacles. Removing obstacles. More and more, I think that's, there's so many things at play, so many things that could be done. It gets confusing. So for me, it's helpful to hang my hat on just, one or two simple phrases. And for me, removing obstacle is a simple phrase. Is this an obstacle for this person? Okay, can I remove it? All right, that's all I had. We have some like 13 minutes left. Open it up to questions, Stephanie. And if you all have battle tactics, I want to hear them.
Thank you so much. I just want to take a moment for a round of applause. That was really something special, especially with the information. I feel like we learned a lot, not only about our university, which, we see from, at least, speaking as a student, but it's different to have numbers to back things up. And I think many of us are very much, have a vision of either staying in research or staying in, academia particularly. And so it's nice to know kind of what to prepare for, and then also what, we see as we may need to change or just be prepared to acknowledge. So that was really, I think, important. And then as well as being able to connect it back, especially last month, we heard from Dr. Martin. And so she definitely, it was interesting seeing her pictures because she was in the field doing research, but obviously I think that was in the closer to the Amazon. So it's just, and then obviously then seeing the differences between those pictures and being male dominated, it's interesting. So I don't want to call Dr. Martin out, but it's just, for me, it was very interesting. So, I've never been questioned as a researcher what my role was, but I've always been accompanied by male counterparts. I've never been, at least internationally researched, I've never had any female leaders to kind of introduce me to the local communities as well as be that representative. So I never really thought about that. But I thought it's interesting. So thank you so much. And with that, I didn't know, I had one question, well, actually two technically, and I can start us off. So in the NC State or the university, the institutional level data, it said URM and underrepresented minorities, I'm assuming. What does that include? Like racial minorities or?
Yeah, so
Okay.
Usually underrepresented minorities at NC State means Latinx, African American, Native American. And I think in that data, they might have included Asian. So there was a category Asian. And so I wasn't really sure, how they're defining Asian.
That's very interesting because, obviously I saw the breakdown between the gender, but then, that's, as we, especially during the past year, and there's been even more so of a surge of social justice issues, particularly in the US, and then also in other countries. And I don't think, at least many of us are still busy working, so we haven't had time to think about how this applies to us when we enter the workforce and when we exit the university, or when we enter university as a professional, not just a student anymore.
And so Stephanie, if I could jump in here, you said that when you were in the field that you were accompanied by men who made key introductions and things like that.
Yes.
That was exactly my case too. What I didn't know was happening at the time was that between my white skin and my foreign status, I was becoming an honorary male.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And I'll have to think about that because I in my experience, I don't know, that could have been. I mean, it was in the Amazonas region of Peru, and it was in forestry. So I mean, I saw females, but they were always the wives of the landowners, and only in one situation did she lead the talk. In all the other situations, it was always me speaking to the male or through my translator if I needed some kind of more local jargon, who was also male. So yeah, that's interesting. So, and then the other one I had was, so could you think of any kind of, like of the joking and kind of the mentiras, like any kind of examples for the forest? Would they be very similar with their content? Obviously over sexualization of women or.
No, the joke that comes to mind is actually class-based.
Mm.
So the joke I heard, which really kind of wasn't a joke, was a couple of campesinos walking. They were kind of on this forestry trip with somebody who wasn't from the region, who had brought their own bottled water, and they emptied out the person's bottled water. And the class comment there was like, if this water is good enough for us, it's kind of good enough for you. And who are you to kind of bring your bottled water in? It was a total power play. Yeah, because of course, if anybody spent a long day in the woods, you need your water. Yeah.
That's interesting. So with that, I wanted to open up. Does anyone else have any questions, comments, anything like that? We still have about 7 minutes until 1.
Hi. I have I have 2 questions. Thank you very much, Nora, for your presentation. I really enjoy it, especially because I also have experience working with rural communities and in Latin America. And in many times, I also experience many things that you mentioned. And I would like to commend you that I am planning to focus my research in the participation of women in natural resource management in 2 sites in Peru. So that's why I also really enjoy more your presentation, because it was very gender focused. So, and also that you mentioned the male dominated context. I think this is very common in many countries in Latin America. So I think it is really applicable to Peru and also to the place I used to work. So my 2 questions are, and if you have more experience or projects working in Latin America. And my second question is, how do you see the current role of women in the natural resource management, the women researchers and the women that are like in charge of managing the natural resources?
Okay, great. So Anna, almost all my work is in Mexico. Almost all my work is in Mexico. So I have a website, norahaenn.org, and just I'll send you there. And I told Stephanie I'm glad to come back and talk about other stuff. But I work in Campeche. I don't know if you know on the Yucatan, and I've been coming and going there for about 25 years. So one of the reasons why this kind of contrast between practitioners and researchers and local natural resource managers came on my radar is because, definitely Mexico's, let's say, version of the EPA, or National Forestry, the federal government in Mexico has made a lot of strides towards gender parity in its staffing, a lot of strides towards gender parity in its staffing. And so there is kind of a contrast that's taking place. It's partly a class contrast. It's also partly an urban-rural difference between these kind of more urban-based and professional, academically at least, professional conservation managers and local practitioners. And so we kind of have to keep that in mind too, because that's also happening. And then women in natural resource management, I mean, it's just so varied. It's so varied. So Mexico's common pool setting is something called an ejido. And these communities are famous for being diverse. So where I work, there's been a little bit of gender gains in the ejido assemblies that decide this kind of natural resource management, but part of that has had to do with migration to the United States. And so you had kind of economic problems. I saw that y'all are interested in rural development. And so part of, my last book was about migration to the United States. Well, this opens up spots in the ejido assembly, whether women actually have decision-making power in those is kind of varied, or whether they're just kind of a placeholder for the absent man. And then finally, I would also say something Mexico did, I think around 2003 or 4, is at a federal level regulate that all the political parties had to have, I think it was 30% of their candidates be women, 30%. So you also saw women entering political office in different places, including at the village level. So it's like, on the one hand, everything's totally different, but on the other hand, you have to look very closely to see if everything isn't really actually the same.
I had a couple questions. You mentioned, I believe it was Julia who was mistaken for a prostitute by going into the forest. So how did she clear up that misunderstanding, and how did that color future interactions within her field work?
Well, she just thought it was hilarious. She just thought it was hilarious. So, you know, I mean, one of the things, yeah, Julia has a great sense of humor. She didn't really necessarily feel the need to clear it up per se. I think she just kind of said something about like, no, that's not what this is about. But she was also really conscious that, again, she was a white foreigner and this person in front of her was very poor. And so in another part, and we could talk about this another day, I'm a fan of this framework called the right use of power. The right use of power. And so in that moment, you know, Julia is recognizing that she's in what's called this up power position, and she needs to be the bigger person.
Well, I would just say, Nora, I really enjoyed all of your presentation, and it really jives with my experiences working in Peru and Mexico also, and Myanmar. And just to say that, yeah, there is a weird status of being the white woman foreigner where you're not, the expectations of what you're supposed to be doing, people don't really know. So there's a lot of confusion about, like, you're here by yourself, are you married? How much money do you make?
Yeah.
what do you, does your family okay with this? You know?
Oh yeah.
But the kind of standards that they want to apply are different, which puts you in a weird position. But I would also just add that I really wish that there were more discussion of this for graduate students starting out, because I feel like personally I went into the field pretty naive, and I'm lucky in that I was, you know, safe and used my own wits and whatever to sort out these dynamics. But I think it's something that we need to prepare students better for. And I did have a few scenarios where I was like, I don't feel comfortable here, and wound up changing field sites and things like that. And just having to be aware of that and having that on your mind, I think is, we need to be more upfront about that with students.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and I want to underscore here. So I've talked about two different gendered settings. You know, men are having different experiences. Men are having different experiences. And it's less stressful on the gender front for men. It is just less stressful. So I think we as women need to be nicer to ourselves, right? And nicer to each other. And, you know, I think we need men to recognize that we're under a different kind of stress, and sometimes more stress, because of all this stuff we have to navigate. And then as far as your comment, Meredith, we are on the same page. I do think there's something about American exceptionalism, that what we're doing is basically socializing our young people into thinking they can be these global saviors. And then what's interesting is that part of the socialization seems to be then unsocializing them. So I kind of did the same thing. You know, people kind of go through this process of, oh, I want to save the world. Oh my gosh, that's racist. Oh my gosh, that's classist. And then over the course of our college or graduate careers, we kind of work our way out of that. But we had to work our way out of it. And by then we already chose our major. We're already in a career path that it's not so easy to just walk away from, and on and on and on. So, you know, I don't have data on that, but I have seen it happen so many times that it is something about our culture, socialization into our place on the global stage. Yeah.
And I would also say, so I'm a queer person, and in some ways I think being more masculine presenting makes things easier for me, although also confusing for people. but that's like a whole other layer of, people asking whether I'm married and all these things and the safety issues. And it's, looking back, it's striking to me that none of my research advisors ever gave me advice or gave me a heads up about how to deal with that, which, in retrospect is kind of a failing.
Yes, and I can say that I only once brought into the field a queer person. I was very worried for him because yeah, I knew that there was anti-queer sentiment. And what was super interesting, and again, this is where the localism matters, and so you do need these kind of local mentors. His sexuality was unreadable to local people. They only saw his madness and his foreignness.
People have no idea. Yeah.
Yes. And it turned out I didn't have to worry about his sexuality at all, for the space of the 6 weeks he was there. Now, if he'd stayed longer and fallen in love or something like that, it would have been a different story. But I did not have to worry about him for a summer field trip.
Yeah.
That is great. I mean, I appreciate both of you sharing that. That's, I want everyone to feel safe the way they can connect to the content personally. And so that, for me, it's in the back of our mind, but especially when we're, if you don't belong to a specific community or you feel that imposter syndrome for that particular role. And so I know a lot of times, a lot of this, talking about gendered issues can be, obviously as a woman, I feel it, but then I acknowledge that it feels different for a man. And I'm conscientious of not saying, oh, this is all wrong. And, men just make us feel this way all the time. Or, obviously with thinking about forestry, what it feels like when you're up and coming in a department where you don't have many models. And I think, Dr. Insoles is on here. And so for me personally, she's been kind of like the biggest model that I've had as an economist, because most of them are, and I guess it's just, it comes with its own territory and I have to be ready for that. But I really wasn't when I first started. And so it's been interesting, but it's good to see too that I think it's really important for us, like you said, to prepare our students and our faculty and staff. So I feel like not just students can benefit from at least thinking about these types of things, particularly when we go back researching, because now that we've been in our kind of American bubble for however long without going into other communities, are we going to then take, how is that going to, like, are we going to bring more of our American aspects, or are we going to be more conscientious of, like you said, how Americans are representative socially in the global context? Yeah. So with that, I see it's 1:05. So if there's any last questions, and people are okay with time, we can stay. And if not, I think for all of us, we'd be very interested to hear about more of your work. So we can definitely think about inviting Dr. Haenn back to in the fall. Since we only have one more meeting, and I think that's a little short notice. So with that, thank you again, everyone, for attending, and thank you for your amazing presentation, Nora. Was it anything else that anyone had to say before we kind of dismiss? Just lots of claps.
Well, just that I miss you all. I wish we could be in person. Erin, I haven't seen you forever.
So that's hopefully
and Meredith, we've never met in person, so hopefully we'll be in the same room soon.
That's the goal. That's hopefully in the fall we will have that option at least a little bit more, or kind of can deviate if even just on campus, but outside depending on the weather. So whatever we can do, and that way we can keep these conversations happening, and hopefully at least be better, like kind of the battle tactics, be more prepared for these types of scenarios out in the field, and hopefully to make our community, or especially at NC State and other universities, more hospitable for these types of interactions. All right, with that, thank you everyone for coming. Have a great weekend, and we will see you next month.